Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, and I'm the director of the Center for Building a Culture, and this is our dialogues on how to build more empathy in the family. And I'm here with Robin Grille. Thanks, Robin, for joining me for this discussion.
I'm having fun already, Edwin. It's great to be with you, and thank you so much for your invitation. It's a privilege.
Oh, great. Perhaps you could introduce yourself, just a little bit about your background. I mean, you're a psychologist in private practice, and you had 20 years, and there's quite a bit that you've done with your books and so forth. So you could just maybe introduce yourself.
Always the hardest thing to do. You know, what approach do I take to introducing myself? Hey, I was born in Uruguay. That's very important to me somehow in ways that I can't even fathom. But in Uruguay, in South America, and I live in Australia, in Sydney, and I'm a psychologist. And one of my favorite things to do that I most enjoy at the moment is that I travel. It's a kind of a busking. I travel with my work, not busking in the sense of playing my guitar on the subway, but I do a lot of workshops and seminars for parents, and or professionals that work with children, teachers, doctors, nurses, social workers, and all over. I've just been to New Zealand, Canada, many places in the US, and all over Australia, and the UK coming up again later on this year. And through that, I get the opportunity to talk to large groups of parents from many nations. So far, only English-speaking nations, but I hope to expand that. I guess what got me these invitations to speak are the articles that I've written, and you've read a few of them. It sounds like they've been translated a lot. Articles about child development, and my two books, Parenting for a Peaceful World and Heart-to-Heart Parenting. And I am very interested in how we develop as children socially, in our capacity for relationship, for giving love, receiving love, social intelligence, it goes hand in hand with emotional intelligence. I'm very interested in how that develops for us, and the pathways of development that are quite universal, that cut across all ethnic boundaries, insofar as we're all biologically at some core level the same. So this is a very universal human story of great concern to me at this point, in that I study a lot about how collectively how we relate to halves the way that a whole society operates. In fact, even at an international level, how countries deal with one another, how cultures relate to the non-human environment as well, our capacity for empathy towards non-human beings, which is sharply into view right now as the basis of our survival. We have some big questions to answer about that right at this point in history. You know, well, so there is yeah.
I just saw that there was a comment you'd made as well that resonated with me, is that that you're into social change, that by changing the family and how the family works and child rearing, that has perhaps the way of having the greatest effect on changing the overall culture to make it maybe a more empathic or caring culture.
Yes. Oh yeah, and I think that human cultures, human societies have always used childhood in this way, not necessarily in a very conscious way, but we have always used childhood in order to design an outcome, because it's childhood is a time when we're all particularly vulnerable to being changed and affected by our environment, our social environment. So you know, for instance, you can change things legally. You can make new laws. Although I don't like your chances right now with governments being where they're at, but we can make new laws to protect the environment and to mandate renewable energy use and that kind of thing. But what a law, and that's important, but what a law cannot do is change the heart. It's a very, very blunt tool. It has limited capacity to create the kind of human being that wouldn't chop down a forest, not because it makes sense to not chop down a forest in the head, but because it hurts to chop down a forest.
Mm.
Now that level of connectedness and sensitivity doesn't come from a law. It comes from how we have neurologically, and even at the level of DNA, how we have been impacted by human relations as we grew up. And I want to say the door doesn't close on the development of empathy when we turn 18 or 25. It's just that things move more slowly thereafter because our brains aren't growing quite as rapidly as they do in early childhood and then in adolescence.
Well, for my quest into empathy and the nature of empathy and how we can create more empathy, it seems that that empathy for me is this foundational value. And if there's even a movement out there, empathic parenting, that we really start with empathy. So that's what I was kind of wanting to hear or talk to you about, is about what you see as the role of empathy in families, in child rearing and parenting, and how important do you see it? You had a comment which we were joking about just before we started, that you've got a quote that I had here is, "Our job is to be teachers of empathy. We are empathy farmers." So it sounds like empathy is an important part to you, and I was kind of like wondering, like, what do you see as that role of empathy?
Oh, so many things to say about that. I've got a slightly different thing that I want to say about what empathy even is. That increasingly, because of all of the research that's being done into empathy, it's really cool to listen to what the neurological, the psychoneurological research. This is very exciting stuff, because now we're discovering that empathy is, of course, it's a value, but it's also so much more, because empathy, let me just define it for a moment. Empathy is that experience where in my body I can feel a little bit of what you feel, so that when you laugh, there's a contagion. I get infected by your laughter and I laugh with you, even if I don't know what you were laughing about. I may not get the joke, and I get infected by your laughter, and that happens. Or if I see you in pain, I feel some of that pain. Not too much, right? Or I'll be dysfunctional. I'll be unhelpful. So I want to say this, that there's a Goldilocks level of empathy, not too hot, not too cold. If I'm flooded with too much empathy for you, I'm dysfunctional. I'm all about rescuing at my own expense, and I'll get sick and potentially die. But not enough empathy, and I'll ignore you, abandon you, or worse, or hurt you. So that it's fundamental.
Okay. Well, what you're tapping into is the mirror neurons. How when we do an action, see an action, the same neurons fire. And so in a sense, we are empathizing all the time. We're kind of like flooded. We're in this world of an empathic world, basically, where we're constantly, as you're seeing my hands wave around, that your neurons are firing, so you could feel like the level, is it a quick movement? You can feel the energy in there. If it's a slow movement, so there's that kind of that quality that you can really pick up the emotion and the felt experience, and even the intentions, like why am I moving, or where am I moving to? So that we really connect at that kind of level is kind of one thing I was hearing.
I could feel, as you move your arms, I could feel my shoulders tensing, and it's to move my arms. I don't know what I was going to do, then dance in front of you as you dance with your arms or something. You know, it is going on all the time, but not as a static. It kind of on and off, and there's reasons for that. But do you know, it's more than the mirror neurons. I mean, the mirror neurons are there, and it's very exciting research how, you know, the exact spot on your brain that is firing a signal of pain is if you stub your toe. And I see that, and if they take a brain scan, it's exactly the same point in my brain that will be firing along with you. We're so intricately joined that way. It's more than the mirror neurons, though. If there are at least 10 brain regions that enable that experience of empathy, that sensation of empathy. You know, the prefrontal lobe area of the forebrain is very important there. Anterior cingulate something or other as well. And I forget all these complicated multisyllabic ancient Greek names that they use, but there's at least 10 brain regions that have been studied, and they will find more. There's a spectacular book by, I got to tell you this because it's wonderful. You know Sacha Baron Cohen?
I know him.
You know, Ali G, Borat. You know, he's got a cousin, Simon Baron Cohen, who's a neuropsychologist from Cambridge University in the UK. And they look very similar. And he's a researcher there, Simon Baron Cohen, Sacha's cousin. And it's like good cousin, bad cousin, you know. He's wonderful people. He wrote a book called The Science of Evil.
There it is.
It's
right
really.
there.
Oh, you got it. Hey,
Got it
of
right
course,
there
of course,
in
you know it. It's easy to read, and it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, great book.
And people like that, they're really showing us empathy. It's more than a value. It's more than a decision that you make with your rational mind. Far more. There is an engine of empathy that is absolutely biological. There is a flesh of empathy, and it's measurable on brain scans. And see, that's helping us to realize that morality is not a concept. We've talked about it like a concept.
Oh, yeah.
And
we're hardwired for morality in that sense.
Yeah, but we need to, I think it's more useful to talk about empathy rather than morality, because you get any two people talking about morality and you'll realize that they disagree on what that is. And it's mixed in with religion, and you know, I prefer to talk about empathy because it's real in the flesh. And I don't know, somehow I trust that more. You know, that
it's like a
if you're healthy,
you're talking about it. Sorry, there's a little bit of a lag. Sorry to be speaking over you. There's a little bit of a lag in the audio.
Okay.
So what I was kind of hearing there is it's in the flesh, so it's embodied. It's in our body, and it's like it's something physical, a physiological thing that's happening. It's not just an abstract value. There's a physiological quality to it. Oh,
you could say, if you like, you have an organ of empathy, and you know, like you have a liver or a pancreas. But it can grow, so that experiences of empathy feed those centers. In fact, in childhood, well, throughout life, but this happens even more quickly in early childhood, that when we feel close, when we feel affection, when we're having a lovely conversation with a friend that we trust, or when we're hugging someone that we love, the body generates oxytocin, the hormone of love, and I'm sure that you've heard that. It's secreted in the brain. It's also secreted in the heart brain, by the way. And in fact, most of the oxytocin is secreted in the gut brain. the brain that is in the lining of the gut, the enteric brain. So in sexual orgasm, we secrete a lot of oxytocin, but in a loving dialogue, we're secreting oxytocin. And there's a double whammy. Oh, by the way, in breastfeeding, babies are drinking a lot of oxytocin through the mother's milk, but also making a lot of their own. Oxytocin it produces profound well-being and a sense of closeness, like it narrows the gap between people. And in a high dose, you're going to bliss. You go into bliss.
Yeah, there's
the double whammy of oxytocin.
Sorry. Yeah, I've got that lag. Sorry about that. I think with one thing when we're talking about you're talking about the oxytocin, how it gets released. I was just going to mention that I think within empathy, that when we empathize with each other, when I hear even in mirroring, physical mirroring, that when we have that sense of mirroring or verbal mirroring, perhaps like with empathic listening and various music, synchronized music, that actually releases oxytocin. So when we listen to someone, are there and empathize with them, that there's a release of oxytocin in that, and it can maybe start a virtuous cycle of, the more relaxed you get, the more oxytocin, the better you can listen to someone, the better you can listen to someone, the more oxytocin gets released.
That's why it's interesting that people say to me, because 3 days in every week I do counseling psychology, psychotherapy, and I'm listening to people, and stories of great pain. And people say to me, when they ask me what to do for my work, they usually say immediately, wow, that must be so stressful and depressing. And I mean, sometimes it can be, but so often it's a place of well-being to be able to listen. That state of openness, when we're not just talking about superficialities, sport and the weather or whatever, and we open up to one another, and what comes forth is our emotional truth. There's going to be some pain, some joy, some anger, some fear, some hopes and dreams. And to go with someone in my room into that sacred space of listening to truth, yes, it can be painful, but at the same time deeply fulfilling. There's a connectedness that produces great wellness, and that's a very hugely rewarding and privileged place to sit. Really, very deeply humbling. So empathy and that extra of oxytocin, it depends on intentional vulnerability. We amplify the empathy experience by speaking our emotion. And that's irrespective of what the emotion is. That also includes anger and fear. People say those are negative emotions. They're not. There is no negative emotion. What's negative is what we might sometimes do with our emotions in acting out. If we're attack one another or abandon one another. And that happens a lot when we feel, when we are very out of control, when we go crazy with emotion. But that intentional vulnerability that we can, we can enter with one another when we say how we feel, that's a contact moment. That is what carries the connection. See, empathy is dependent on sensation. So that if you're completely, for instance, if you're somebody that's completely remote and absent emotionally, it's it might be a little bit more difficult initially for me to be triggered into empathy. Do you see that?
Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
what I was hearing there, it's about the more honest you can be about sharing your internal feelings,
Yeah.
that the better you can make an empathic connection with someone else, that there's something about that openness and vulnerability of sharing your feelings that helps create an empathic connection.
I think
That's good.
so, and you know, I mean, that's an easy thing to test. I mean, just notice how when you see somebody being open emotionally, your heart goes to them. You're in a sense that you're helpless to your own compassion.
Mm-hmm.
As if the compassion, you don't need to conjure it up. Let's be compassionate.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's an accident that happens to you. If the empathy centers neurologically in your body are healthy enough, compassion just comes and gets you, right?
Mm-hmm.
What you need to do is just open the window and look and listen. And if someone is open with you, you're moved.
Yeah,
You're moved, and then
especially like in a
what?
movie or with a person who's in great, like crying. Like I just feel drawn into the tears, and I can feel myself and just like instantaneously being pulled emotionally, feeling what it is
All
that
of it,
they're feeling.
absolute, all of it. You know, it's um, you know, if somebody's angry. That if somebody that you've empathized with in a movie, even they're angry and you feel some of the anger with them, or they're afraid and you feel afraid. We go through, it's an emotional roller coaster every time we read a story or see a movie, and or listen to each other's story. That's why I love story. I love story. It is a carrier of emotional experience, which opens the door of empathy for one another. So
There's a couple of things about the vulnerability is I've heard a lot Brene Brown talks about, well, you have to be vulnerable, you know, out there, and it's important and so forth. But one thing I found that vulnerability is a sense that if you're in a dangerous situation, if you're in an environment that's judgmental, you know, demeaning or what have you, it's hard to open up in a situation like that. Well, if I'm in an environment where people are really empathizing with me, listening to me, hearing me, it's not even vulnerable. I'm not even really being vulnerable because there's no threat. The empathy, I know that the empathy is there, so I can really allow more of myself to be shared. And it's not even like, I'm not like making this big conscious effort to be, you know, vulnerable. It's that I'm just being with friends and being open, and that's just how things are.
I guess, I mean, yeah, you're pointing to a semantic issue a little bit in that what do we mean when we talk about vulnerability? And I'm glad you raised that because so not to confuse everyone, vulnerability doesn't mean necessarily lying on the ground in deep terror because you're in terrible danger. It's that what I refer to when I use that word in this particular context is that little risk-taking moment. It does always feel at least a tiny little bit like a risk of I will willingly let my emotions show a little bit. And sometimes that's very easy with friends that you really, really, really trust. Most of the time we tend to feel a little bit of a barrier because we've needed to have an inhibitory barrier. We've needed to have a little bit of armoring or a lot of armoring because we've all met moments of trauma in our life or abandonment or some kind of assault, some kind of violence, you know, teachers that yelled at us and screamed at us or parents that spanked us or whatever it might be, all kinds of stories. We all have some of that. So we've learned how to not be vulnerable. And I would suggest, you know, choose wisely who you're open with and when. You know, I don't, I wouldn't want to, be indiscriminately open everywhere I go. We make, but safe. It's about safety, a safe enough place for that. However, having said that, sometimes it can be a little surprising how when we thought that we needed to be armored and to hide, that, because of a lifetime of that defensive habit, when we're feeling under some kind of threat, sometimes it can be surprising that to make the decision then to be vulnerable, that's what creates peace. Because I could say the same thing in reverse. Sometimes it's our defensiveness that creates the other person's defensiveness. Mm-hmm. And then we blame them for it. So there's an intricate conversation between all human beings that's about opening and closing, opening and closing, opening and closing all of the time. And there's a lot of reverberation in that from our histories. Very painful things, very, very, very scary things that we experienced early in life that create a kind of like a rust on the hinges of the door where we get stuck in terms of the opening and closing. In terms of intimacy, we're all scared of each other, I think. That's quite unconscious most of the time, but we're pretty cautious. And there are trust issues, and it's different for everyone, but fundamentally there are trust issues. And we have, I'm conscious of some of the earlier questions you asked too. What does this have to do with parenting?
Well, this is really great for me. I'm really enjoying this, going into like the definitions kind of from this perspective, because it's very much how I view the empathy, and not a lot of people I've talked to have spoken at it from quite from this angle, which I think I just find really quite enriching. So I'm really enjoying kind of this aspect of it. I did want to add one part too, is the in terms of like the definitions of empathy is always comes up, like what are we talking about, and kind of grounding it in this mirror neurons and oxytocin and just what's really going on, I think is like really really helpful. There's another aspect of empathy which sometimes is called cognitive empathy, and it gets all very confusing because people use all these different terms, but I would call imaginative empathy, which is sort of a role-playing, in the sense that what you've talked about is empathy as, feeling each other into each other's experience. There's this other level of empathy which seems to be connected to imagination, where I can take on the role. I can say, well, what is it like to be Robin Grille? Like, I can take on the role and I can start feeling into it, perhaps like an actor, maybe Meryl Streep, takes on the role of Margaret Thatcher, or, one of these other people, and she just totally embodies it and is really just taking on the vocabulary, the tone, just kind of feeling that person. And that imaginative empathy seems to be like built on top of that core kind of more of a mirroring empathy. And even it seems to it's quite powerful in the sense that we can empathize with anything. We can empathize, with a beam of light. I imagine it was Einstein when he was doing the theory of relativity. He was imagining, I am a beam of light. I'm traveling, at this. What's my experience being this beam of light, or on a train or whatever? So there's just that added, what I call it imaginative empathy. I'm wondering what comes up for you around that experience.
Yeah, really, really powerful. And I think that that's a different kind of entry point for the experience of empathy. Definitely, you can you can empathize with a tree.
Yeah.
Going deeply into an imaginative state about being a tree and experiencing the world from the point of view of a tree. And without even sitting anywhere near a tree, you can be in a room where you can't even see a tree. And I do this work with people quite a bit, where, you know, to empathize with being a baby, for instance, because I think our society has collectively lost a massive amount of empathy for babies. For a long time, we have treated babies like they're not persons. In some horrific ways, actually. Do you know, in Australia, they were performing circumcision on infants without anesthetic until the 1990s, because pediatricians were saying that babies don't feel pain.
Mm.
They scream like we do, worse, but somehow that's not in a baby, that's not pain. I see that all the time. People ignoring babies, and wheeling them in a stroller. What do you call that in the States?
Yeah, stroller. Call it a stroller, baby
stroller.
carriage.
Yeah, and a baby just in abject misery, crying away, looking for a pair of eyes, looking for someone familiar that they can see, wanting to be picked up and held. But parents can be just utterly ignoring the cries of the baby and just having a conversation amongst themselves, whatever, smoking a cigarette. So then the baby is someone that doesn't exist as a person, human baby. They are awarded personhood when they turn 3 or 4 and they can speak really well. This still happens quite a bit, although it's getting less. So, you know, you were talking about imaginative empathy. Sometimes I ask people to go into the state of being a baby. And it helps to be in the physical position of a baby, lying down, where you can feel the perspective of a baby on the world, where the world is above you. And where, you know, that dependency state. You can, and that's very, very powerful. I think right there, what you're feeling is your own feelings rather than the feelings of another. The imagination is a very, very, very powerful projector where you place yourself in the experience of another being. And it's a tremendous doorway. And by going through that exercise, it starts to leave you potentially more open to the actual other. So whether it's a tree or a beam of light or a baby, or, you know, imagine what it would feel like to be, you know, a child in Syria, or imagine what it would be like to be a shark who's about to have their fin chopped off, or a white rhino. You know, we can do that. It's definitely a powerful conduit. But in order for that to work, you need to have intact some of your own capacity for feeling your own feelings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's I mean, I think this is really great that we've kind of gone into almost like the definition of empathy, because I kind of see like a series of components of empathy, and I call it the wheel and feel of empathy. That there's the self-empathy, which is what you're saying, to be able to feel into your own self. What am I feeling now? You know, I'm feeling a spaciousness. I'm feeling a little stress here, right in the chest. I feel a little anxiety because I'm wanting like good connection, audio connection, and periodically your audio kind of breaks up and a little tension comes into my, you know, right in here, like, oh no, I'm really enjoying this, and the audio is going to break up or something. So I feel a little tension kind of in this part of me. So I would say I calling that self-empathy. It's that sensory awareness of what's going on inside of myself. And then there's this mirrored empathy, I'm seeing you, kind of with your hands on here, and I can kind of feel, and the smile, I can feel the smile that's coming up as you smile. And so that's like another level of, or another aspect of empathy. And then there's that imaginative empathy where we can do the role playing. And I've even done in role playing with emotions, like somebody who's having a conflict inside of themselves with their creativity and judgment. That every time they had creativity, their judgment came in and said how terrible it was. And then they would feel pain. And they came to the point they didn't want any creativity because it was just too painful. So someone else and I took on the role of their emotion. I was her creativity, and the other person was the judgment. And we had an empathic dialogue with her creativity and judgment, doing role playing, tapping into our own personal feelings that arose. And we did that for like 40 minutes. And for this person, it was like totally transformative, because it was like integrating two parts of herself that were having this empathic dialogue. And for her, it was like spot on. It was like exactly her experience, even though it was my experience coming up. So somehow there's like this tapping into kind of a common humanity or something. And then from there, another component would be, I would call it empathic creativity and action, that when we connect very deeply to each other, there's a quality of the action that arises that is kind of a frictionless sort of an action that we take together. And so that's another component of kind of the model that, how I'm kind of using empathy.
Really, yes. Wow, this is so interesting. I love what you were saying about the judge and the creator together, and that, that dialogue that you facilitate, that has implicit empathy for the judge.
Yep.
it's where the creator and the judge start becoming friends by hearing each other's reality. Tell me your story, and I will listen, and I'll tell you my story. And it's, that's what mobilizes finally all of us, in that, see, so frequently we feel like the judgmental part of ourselves is the enemy.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And everybody, in a Judeo-Christian kind of post-traumatic Judeo-Christian shock that we're recovering from, or trying to recover from, it was like, thou shalt not judge, don't judge. So we judge the judge. But it's, I really think that what I'll put it in a very crude way, the cure for judgment is curiosity. Can we be curious about whether judgment, why the judge in ourselves is judgmental? And then the judge is not so lonely anymore. And the judge will tell you a story that will make you go, oh, no wonder. You were scared, no wonder. And you're trying to be protective, and no wonder. I love to say this as a kind of a way to have a handle for the empathy, that final empathy experience. There's a kind of an arrival place, it feels like, where you finally get through the story who the other is, so that the other is a part of you. And it's when you say, well, no wonder, no wonder. You can listen to your own judgmental self. And if you listen well with plenty of curiosity, you'll hear a story, and you finally get, no wonder you're so judgmental. No wonder you're pointing the finger and saying, stop it, or don't sing in public, or don't paint that painting, it's going to be crap, or, no wonder that,
There's an
empathy,
understanding.
yeah, you see past behavior into the being, into the person. That's that's a road to Damascus moment. That's a joy moment of where we're closer, where we're not kind of an opposite anymore.
Well,
Fundamental.
when we did that exercise, it's like I was the creativity, the other person took on the role of the judgment, but we did it within and that's like typical. I mean, you see this in different psychology, Gestalt, and so forth, where you just have these parts dialogue with each other. But we added an element that was an empathic element, so that the parts had to do empathic listening with each other. So as the judge would say whatever was going on with the judge, the creativity would empathize, say, well, I'm hearing you say that this is really important to you, and you're feeling afraid that some harm is going to happen to you. And so it was like this kind of layering of, I mean, you're saying like curiosity, but it was have the parts dialogue with empathy for each other, I guess was like another.
There needs to be, there needs to be a holding for the dialogue to happen in a way that leads to empathy. There needs to be a kind of a holding. So, for instance, if you sit me in a room with a serial killer, I won't feel much empathy for the killer. I will feel a rush of empathy for myself, and I will want to get the hell out of there. This is like I'm using an extreme, right, as an example. And I don't want to have a lot of empathy in that moment. I just want to get the hell out of there. I think that's good. I think that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's a held, safe environment where no one can hurt one another, and someone is like, I guess, some kind of a facilitator or a referee that says, no, wait a minute, don't interrupt now. Just hear the story through. Notice what happens, what you feel in your body as you hear the story. Don't interrupt right now, and then you will have your turn. If it's made safe that way,
yeah.
So that's what I mean by holding. And I hear that serial killer story. I can tell you with a lot of confidence that at the beginning, I'll probably hate the guy, and I will find the guy absolutely repulsive as a human being, and I won't care what happens to him. And I'll be having horrible thoughts of capital punishment and all that kind of stuff and revenge, just like everyone else does. But if there's a holding for the dialogue to make it safe, and I listen to the guy's story, like the story. Who was this guy as a child? How did he experience the world as a child? This is where the childhood becomes important. Very important. Who was he when he was most vulnerable? What's going to start to happen, and I'm so confident of this because I've lived this many, many times with horrible people, I'm going to start to care for the guy and to feel a rush of empathy. I still need to feel safe, This is still a dangerous person in terms of the behavior. But I can see I'm going to get a lot of, no wonder. Moments of, no wonder.
Mm-hmm.
That's how we come to befriend the shadow. And this gets right back to childhood and to oxytocin.
Well, before we go there, I wanted to just share what kind of happened for me as you were talking about that. When you talked about being with the killer, and I kind of brought up the sense of fear, like, fear is kind of arose. And I thought, well, this person, there's fear arising, and the fear is there to protect me in a sense, because this person might do harm to me. So the fear has something. But as you were saying that, I was looking at the fear saying, the fear is, I don't know, it was something like I was starting to empathize with the fear, and I actually got a little tearful as I was doing that. It's like, fear, that really having that dialogue with fear, and somehow is something that kind of arose. So anyway, it was a very, for myself, but I could just feel a well of kind of emotion of like tearfulness that came up to me, just kind of thinking about the fear and kind of being present with the fear and empathizing with fear.
We need permission to deeply self-empathize when we're afraid, and see, this is where empathy for the other is never going to be like a constant unmoving state. We need to have the ability to deeply self-empathize, sometimes at the exclusion of the other, when we're in danger, when there's an emergency, when we're really, really afraid and we need to run, or when there's a need to, in an emergency, to self-defend. Those are all examples of moments where it's important to switch off. And biologically, that happens quite automatically, where you're no longer empathic for the other, but you're super empathic, hopefully, for yourself. So, there's a lot to say about empathy. It's not just this stasis. It's a moving. What's important with empathy is the fluidity of it.
Yeah, I use
empathy exhaustion as well, that we can get over. We can get over, literally exhausted. If you live with somebody with who's in a deep depression, that humanly you will come to a point that you need to ask other people to be the helper, because you'll suffer empathy fatigue. You can be a saint, but you'll suffer empathy fatigue, and you need to turn your empathy in towards yourself a lot, and to restore, to re-nourish your heart. Right?
Yeah, so what I was hearing there is about that you can, if you're in a person with someone who's depressed, that you would, in your empathizing with them, you would start taking that on, or you're in an environment where there's like a lot of suffering, that you would take that on, you would become kind of fatigued, and then you have to maybe shut yourself off to kind of get energized or less fatigued.
Yeah, you can see people that are stuck in over-empathizing for everyone else, like somebody who's stuck in being a rescuer. Who live in, I'm sure you've met people or felt sometimes in your own life where you can burn out to the point of suffering ill health or worse. You can burn out when there isn't a fluidity of, empathizing for others, and then coming back to self, empathizing and re-nourishing self. There's a time to say, I won't be the helper or the rescuer right now. We need to have other people do this.
Yeah,
I need to come back.
That's like an argument, against empathy that I've seen there. The way I've looked at it is that is not necessarily empathy overload, that it's actually empathy deficit. And I'm trying to figure out how to kind of articulate this. But at that point, if I'm kind of having that what you're calling overload, it's that I am not receiving the empathy that I need to connect with myself in a way. So usually in a situation like that, the solution is for me to be heard by others. It's like in that case, with depression, people don't have the space to listen to me, for example. So I'm like listening, I'm being present to them, and they're not having the space to empathize with me. So I'm kind of having an empathy deficit in myself. So I guess I'm looking, I don't know if that's making sense. Instead of saying that that's empathy fatigue, I'm saying it's actually empathy deficit.
Do you know why I like to talk about this to and fro of empathy is that it's precisely what you said a moment ago. Sometimes I want to protect empathy from the bad name by saying that the problem isn't empathy. The problem is when in those moments when we get unbalanced in terms of, we over empathizing with the other and then lose empathy for self, you know, when lose recognition that, well, I need to ask for some attention for me. And that's what I mean by nourishment.
Mm-hmm.
We do get empty. We get empty, and we, you know, periodically need to reach out and say, will someone listen to how tired I am, or will someone put their hand on my shoulder and say, wow, you've been really, you know, doing a lot, and I can see you, you know.
But that's exactly the empathy deficit.
Yeah.
That's like you are not receiving the empathy that you need. So because you're not receiving the empathy you need, it's not that you're like being overloaded with empathy, it's that you're not, it's an empathy deficit.
For the self.
For the self, yeah, because we all, we're holding everybody's needs for empathy kind of equally, and it means that I am not receiving the empathy that I need. For me, it's kind of quite fundamental in that it's one of the major criticisms I see out there for empathy. It's like, well, you can't have empathy because it'd be overloaded. And I guess I'm trying to say that actually that's not the problem. The problem is actually it's an empathy deficit. It's being described as a problem with empathy, and it's actually the problem of not having enough empathy is kind of for self, which is
well, you know, this is how I experience that rhythm, and it is a rhythm. I love that it's a rhythm. I'm a drummer, actually. I love everything. Everything in life is about rhythm, breathing. The way that I experience that in my work is that I really feel it. When I see too many people in one day. So I go out of my way to leave quite a bit of time, at least half an hour between clients, which means that I see probably less clients than most psychologists in Australia. But I do feel a sense of, it's like a physical sense of overload, where I'm fatigued and irritable, where I notice that my listening capacity is finite. You know, that I can't even listen to wonderful things. You know, past a certain point where, so there's a rhythm to observe, to be faithful to, and I don't stay on top of this rhythm very well all the time. You know, I'm learning more and more as I go to listen to my body. But you know, between sitting and listening a lot to a client and enjoying that, I like to have a moment, half an hour of complete quiet where I'm not with anyone, listening to myself or doing something very superficial. You know, checking in on Facebook or something, or playing my guitar, or making a cup of tea, going for a walk, being alone. So it's rhythmic, and I guess you could look at that as the rhythm of, you know, pointing my empathy towards another and then towards myself.
So you're seeing kind of a rhythm. Is what I was hearing is like you're empathizing with someone else and then having time to connect with your own self, and that there's maybe a sense of equilibrium or balance that comes in through that. Kind of a replenishing.
When you start to feel, if you're sensitive enough to, your body will tell you very truthfully, you're sensitive enough to those signals of strain, then you know you've gone out of balance in one direction, and it's time to, as gracefully as possible, to then move from connection with other and then connection back to self, which requires quiet often, noiselessness. Yeah, to me that's that feels healthy. I'm not always healthy, I'll tell you that, but that feels a healthy.
To have that time for yourself to kind of replenish and. I mean, something that
Then,
comes up.
I can also get tired of listening to myself and my own story. You know, that can be, you know, that can be a little stale after a while. And then, well, I want to be with others and connect with others, and you know, be attentive to nature or other human beings. You know,
There's
it's
something about changing the energy levels and not getting kind of stuck in kind of maybe one way or something.
I really see to and fro. I see. I
Okay.
think like this figure eight. That's how it comes up visually for me.
Well, that's something that's interesting, because something I do is, and this is something I've wondered about with therapy, because it sounds like this happens partially in therapeutic relationship. It's the therapist listening to the client, doing listening to the client, and it's kind of like a one-way listening. And it seems to me that that's been kind of a problem, in the sense that the client is not getting to practice both sides of the empathy of listening and being heard. And they might be in terrible distress. They're partly there because they're in terrible distress and they're needing kind of that emergency empathy. But it seems like one of the steps is actually for them to start practicing listening to you.
Absolutely. Look, there is a movement in the world of therapy that recognizes that, see, if I'm your client and you're my therapist, and you're all that you are is empathy towards me and listening towards me and making it all about me, you know, I will feel like, well, that's wonderful attention. I'm going to love that. There are going to be moments when that feels very frustrating to me, because there's equally a hunger in me to know, well, what impact am I having on you? When do you feel, you know, I need to hear what you go through emotionally when you sit at the other end of me. And if you're going to be honest, there's times when you are moved, there's times when you care, when you feel sad with me, when you might feel a little irritated sometimes. You know, that if you're honest with me, you might even be a little bit disappointed that I arrived late, or you might feel sometimes kind of annoyed because I'm talking a lot but not you know, avoiding my feelings or not connecting with you, hiding from you. You will, or sometimes you might feel, you know, overwhelmed by my story, and oh my goodness, or you have feelings. You have your own feelings. Now, this is dangerous, because you can, as a therapist, you have a position of responsibility where it is primarily about me, your client. You're on the side of complete anonymity. You're not real to me anymore. And there's something missing. And you see, it's the same with children. The moment that they go from babies into toddlers, what fundamentally changes, you know, baby just needs you to say yes, 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 and it is all about you. And that's all they can cope with. Gradually, as they enter the toddler years, and then more and more as they grow up, they hunger for knowing who you are and the realness of you. They are starting to hunger for the experience of having empathy for you. You need to get real. What's a real person? Not a role and an authority who sets rules. That's just a cardboard, two-dimensional thing. A real person is somebody who has needs, limits, and feelings. Which means that if, as a parent, we don't show a little bit, just a safe amount of when we are annoyed, sad, hurt, you know, when our children have an impact on us. You know, our older child bullies the younger sibling. We feel hurt by that. We might feel also, you know, a little bit of anger about that. If we don't let those feelings show in a safe way, they get frustrated. And I see children react to that frustration by becoming incredibly provocative. I've seen little children physically punch their mothers. It's scary stuff. They hit them because of this frustration that you're always just nice and always gentle, soft, 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 but I don't get the real you. There's an essence of you that you're holding back. And that doesn't nourish me anymore.
So there's something about seeing how my actions affect you, what's arising for you through my actions, and actually hearing that there's something almost like a need that we have to, or there's something about that's nourishing to us.
Absolutely. And if I can't see in the changes in your eyes and in your voice and in your face, if I can't see how I impact you, then I feel horribly alone. And it's disturbing because your body is there, but there's no responsiveness to my presence, including that sometimes I'm annoying to you. So, you know, the empathy isn't being empathic and being empathic. It's taught by being an appropriate feeling so that we feel real for the other. And this is important for children too, that if you want their empathy to grow, it begins by showing them empathy for their feelings. But then as they become toddlers, there's the two-way street where we need to show them something in us to have empathy for. Or then they don't feel empathy for us, and that can't develop. You know, we hunger to have empathy for other people because that's equally pleasurable to the heart as it is to receive empathy. We're all just deeply hunger for that.
Well, one process, I mean, kind of framework that we use is like empathy circles. So it's mutual. We have like small groups, 4 people to a group. And then we do mutual empathic listening with each. So more of a peer-to-peer. And by having like 4 people, there's a variety of perspectives. For me, at least, there's something that's nice about the different energies from a variety of people, but then also having a lot of time to be engaged versus like in a really big circle where just one person talks and it takes forever to get to me. I like kind of being engaged more. So I think maybe that's kind of explaining what it is that I find more nourishing about that it's kind of this back and forth between multiple people and multiple energies, that I'm actually getting to say that, I'm really pissed off about this, but I feel safe about saying it because I know that you're going to just reflect it and hear it, and then, we're going to move to wherever it takes us, and it's creating that safe container, which you had mentioned before.
Okay, and you even take that moment there where you said, I feel pissed off about this. I noticed a little micro moment of excitement in my chest, where my chest goes, wow, you get pissed off about stuff. I want to get to know you some more. What do you get pissed off about? And now what is that?
Yeah.
Let's look at that. Why is it that I feel closer to you? And anger is supposed to be a bad thing. Well, it is because, historically people use their anger to be violent. But you didn't just then. And I feel one little step of being closer to you, because you're a guy that gets pissed off about things just like me, and it's exciting, and I tell you what, I spent about 6 years, doing a lot of encounter group kind of stuff, sitting in circle with big groups, and it was some of the most deeply, deeply transformative, life-changing, and incredibly nourishing moments of my life. And if there's one thing that I really learned in every cell of my body is that we want to know each other, and that the moments we remember forever and ever and ever aren't really, hey, when I bought that great car or something. The moments we remember forever and ever are when I opened my heart a little, and so did you, and we saw each other a little bit out of control, in control, out of control. and there's floods of empathy flowing like rivers in that moment. That's what makes everything work. That's where that two-way kind of flow of empathy provided
It's the
through
connection. It's like that connection outside of control, outside the physical bodily control. It's just like this raw.
Which comes through showing emotion. You know, when we are a little bit less in control, we show we're sad, we're angry, we're afraid, we're enjoy, excited. That it's by definition a little bit less control. We radiate more. We're more like we're more light, more colorful, and that's the conduit of. That's what brings us to each other. We're closer. You know. And that's what makes good society. People that cry together, laugh together, and get outraged together, those are the people that then behave well towards each other more likely, treat each other better, stay friends for longer. It produces loyalty. You know, we shared a moment of shared emotion together. I want to do something nice for you. I'll remember you next week. You know? Now, we are by virtue of our belonging. That's the human animal. And that's why empathy is the currency. And that's the thing to the empathy experience, the two-way, as we were saying, two-way flow, ebb and flow of empathy. That's the thing to cultivate. That's what's going to get us through.
Your audio, are you still there? Oh. Are you still there?